Welcome back. I'm Adrian Harewood, coming to you live from Laurier and Elgin. We are inside Confederation Park, and as you can see behind me, there are cyclists who are gathered here. It's for an event called Critical Mass, and it happens on the last Friday of every month, not just here in Ottawa, but in cities around the globe. And it's described as a kind of a protest, a monthly protest by cyclists to reclaim the streets. Now, this is happening on the heels of another cycling death in our city on Tuesday. A young boy, 13-year-old Simon Khouri, was riding his bicycle on Jeanne d'Arc Boulevard in Orleans when he was hit by a car and he later died. Now, earlier today, I had a chance to speak with an avid cyclist. His name is Emmanuel Franco-Laporte. He's ridden in many different places, and we wanted to talk about the safety here in the city and what needs to be done to make this a place where cyclists can feel secure. Here's our conversation. Emmanuel, why are you here today?
So I'm here because I believe it's important to raise awareness in cycling in our city. There is awareness at the administration, but drivers are definitely, a lot of drivers don't seem to be very conscious of cyclists on the road and may not necessarily be sharing the road as much as they should. And it puts us all at risk, essentially. So I believe it was very important to support Critical Mass today, especially considering there was the death of a very young 13-year-old boy recently in Orleans, and only 2 months ago also there was a man in his 50s who was killed by a driver just 1 block away from here on Laurier Street as well.
How safe are Ottawa streets for cyclists?
It's really hard to tell. It really depends on where you are and when you're cycling as well. So especially during rush hour, when there's a lot of traffic downtown, people are in a rush to get to work or to go back home, and drivers are not necessarily as attentive as they should be. So you see drivers sometimes not checking their blind spots, turning without putting their signals. You see also cyclists are sometimes getting impatient and cycling between cars, and it also makes drivers, it gives them a harder time to see cyclists, especially when the cyclists are navigating between cars as well.
So given what you're describing, are you afraid when you're riding your bike in the city?
I wouldn't say I'm afraid, but I can feel my blood pressure raise a little bit when I'm biking downtown and when I'm surrounded by cars and buses and trucks. They're all trying to fight for their own space on the road as well as my own space. So it does make me a little bit more nervous for sure. So whenever I can, I will try to use bike lanes, but sometimes it's just not practical.
What's your assessment of the cycling infrastructure in the city?
So the infrastructure is very incomplete at times. There will be instances where we will be in a bike lane on the road, and that bike lane will all of a sudden end. Typical example would be on Mackenzie Bridge, where we're crossing the bridge and there's a bike lane, and then all of a sudden the bike lane disappears and there's trucks coming from the Queensway essentially on our right. So it's very hard to figure out where to go. So essentially we should get off our bike and use the pedestrian paths to get back on the road, but it makes it very dangerous.
How does your experience riding your bike here compare with other cities where you've had that opportunity to ride?
So I've lived 2 years in Montreal, and there's a lot of traffic, as you know, in Montreal. I actually felt safer in Montreal.
How come?
Well, simply because there's constant activity in Montreal. There's a lot of traffic, there's pedestrians jaywalking everywhere, there's cars turning everywhere, and there's a lot of cyclists too. Drivers are obligated to watch the road much more than in Ottawa. They will look everywhere because there's going to be someone in their way everywhere. In Ottawa, we don't have as much of that problem because a lot of drivers will be coming from higher speed roads or coming from the suburbs, and they won't be used to cyclists, and all of a sudden they arrive downtown and they need to transition to a much more defensive driving. And that transition doesn't always happen.
Is it then that there's more of a biking culture in Montreal? Because you're not saying that if the roads were busier here, that drivers would be more conscious.
I'm not exactly saying this, but drivers who have been living their entire lives in busier streets are more conscious. So, and again, I don't know for sure. I would suspect that someone who has been driving downtown their whole life because they live downtown would probably be more conscious of cyclists than a driver that would be living in the suburbs and going downtown every now and then.
Emmanuel, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And that was my conversation with Emmanuel Franco-Laporte. And Lucy, the funeral for 13-year-old Simon Khouri will take place tomorrow at 9 a.m. at St. Paul Syriac Catholic Church on Kilbourne in Alta Vista. Lucy, back to you.